Hello, hello. I'm Casey, and as you can see, there is no Fallon here. For those of you who are watching the actual video, for those of you who are listening, you cannot see, but Fallon is not able to be with me for this episode. She's got a little bit of illness moving around in her house. So fingers crossed that everybody gets to feeling better very soon and she's able to be with me on the next one. But for now, I just have to deal with me all by my lonesome. Hopefully that's not creepy. But I guess I'm not like alone. I got my dog here. Ayla. Hi, Ayla. So if you see moving around in the background, nobody panic. It's just me dog. Today is going to be the first episode of the 50 States series that, if you've been watching, you know we've been talking about. And the very first state in that series is Alabama. So I did a true crime case out of Alabama, and I picked one that I had personally never heard of that I thought was pretty interesting. So hopefully you guys do too. But before we get into that, I thought I'd try something a little bit different for just the 50 States series. And if you guys don't like it, please feel free to comment or let me know. And if you don't, I'll flip it back to doing what I've been doing for all the other episodes. So I thought that instead of doing a fun fact with these, I might try to inspire a little bit more listener interaction and engagement, or get your brains rolling a little bit more. So I thought I would go with kind of like philosophical questions or questions about life, or things that just might get your brain really rolling or thinking or reflecting for a minute. So let's give that a try and see how we like it. If you don't, I'll reel it right back in and we'll flip right back over to the fun facts. So my question for this episode is, how do you know when you're being really, truly authentic? Like, in what moments in your life do you know without a doubt you are 100% being true to yourself and whoever you may be engaging with? For example, when I tell my husband or my kids that I love them, even if it's 1,000 times a day, I know I'm 100% authentic every time I say it, because I mean it every time. I know I love them with my whole heart, but that seems kind of like a cop-out answer. So, and by a cop-out answer, I mean it's an answer everybody would hopefully give, because you hopefully all know that you love your families from the bottom of your heart, and you're truly authentic when you say that. So for just this question, let's take the loved ones out of it. And let's think about, how do you know when you're out in the world or you're engaging with strangers or doing something that you're being truly authentic when you do it? Food for thought. I don't expect you to like respond to me personally. Like, by no means am I trying to make you guys feel like you need to respond, but obviously I would love if you did. That would be a great conversation to have, but you're not obligated by any means. It's more just hoping you guys maybe have a little personal insight for yourselves on these questions, if I continue to do them. But I would like to hear your answer. If you want to share it, that would be great. So feel free. But the point is just to get your brain rolling and thinking and inspire you to truly reflect on yourself for a few seconds of the day. That being said, and my ranting being done, and hopefully you've taken a moment to ponder that question, let's dive into the case. This case is called Nannie Doss, aka the Giggling Grannie. And again, in case you missed it, the first state that we're doing in this series is Alabama. Nancy Nannie Doss Hazel was born on November 4th, 1905. She was later referred to by several different things, such as the Giggling Grannie, the Lonely Hearts Killer, the Black Widow, and also the Lady Bluebeard. She was born in Blue Mountain, Alabama, to Louisa Lou Hazel. And although James Hazel is credited as being her father and who she knew to be her father, he wasn't her biological father. In fact, Nannie was actually already born when James proposed to Lou, and she would end up being the oldest of 5 children. She would end up having 3 sisters and a brother. All of these kids would have a pretty difficult childhood, but Nannie by far would have the worst one of all. Being the oldest and the only non-biological child of James, she was definitely treated differently, and a lot more of the responsibility and expectation was put on her throughout her whole life because she was the oldest. See, James had a farm, and he depended on that farm for everything. Unfortunately, more often than not, that farm wasn't very fruitful. So instead of viewing his family as, well, a family, he more so viewed them as laborers. He would require Lou to spend pretty much every spare minute she had working in the fields until Nannie was old enough to start picking up some of the work, which, by the way, his idea of old enough, she was 5 when he had her out there clearing debris and doing the same kind of work he and Lou were doing. And with every kid born, the same level of expectation was there, but not necessarily the same level of enforcement was used. Along with his strictness when it came to working on the farm, he was also abusive in general to the kids and Lou, and he was extremely controlling. The girls were not allowed to dress as girls. They weren't allowed to fix their hair up or do their makeup. He wouldn't allow them to go anywhere alone or without him or their brother. He wouldn't let them go to school during any harvest times of the year. The only real reprieve Nannie had on the farm were the romance stories she would read in her mother's magazines. She would read those stories for hours. Despite all his abuse and sternness, when it was off season and there wasn't any work to be done on the farm, the family would often travel to visit relatives. One of these trips in particular was a trip Nannie would never forget, and it would change her forever. The family had decided to go south to visit James's side of the family, but when they chose to go, a winter storm was moving in. They opted to take a train for their travels, and while on the train, at some point, the train would abruptly slam on its brakes due to the storm causing a tree to fall on the tracks. When that happened, Nannie was thrown forward out of her seat and she hit her head on a metal bar that was right in front of her. She would black out for the rest of the train ride and wake up in her uncle's house. From that moment on, Nannie would experience frequent severe headaches, blackouts, depression, and sometimes she would fly into an uncontrollable extreme rage that she would just kind of have to wait for it to subside on its own. She didn't know what to do with it. It was clear she had a concussion and some significant damage from hitting her head, but James refused to let Lou take her to the hospital, claiming that they couldn't afford the hospital bill. So Nannie would just have to learn to cope with the side effects over time. These side effects weren't the only ones that came from this accident. Nannie was now seeing the world from a whole new perspective, and all of her father's controlling ways and favoritism towards her siblings, along with his abuse, was now front and center in her eyesight, and this would be the first time she would feel hate. She began to hate her father with everything she had. Once she developed this anger towards James, her focus became to find someone who truly loved her. She became obsessed with her romance stories that she read and imagining a world where she too would be swept away by a man who would love her forever and take her away from the farm. She had an idea of how she wanted to be treated, but she had to figure out a way to get out from underneath James's thumb and see what she would actually come up with, is that she would recommend to James that she should get a job in town so that they would have a steady flow of income all year round, regardless of whether they had harvests or not. And to her surprise, he agreed to let her do it. This would be the first taste of freedom that Nannie would get. She began working at a linen factory. It wouldn't take long for her to attract a fella. In fact, she would attract her first husband there, 17-year-old Charlie Bragg. And again, to her surprise, her mom and dad actually really liked Charlie. She thought she'd done it. She finally found her hero. They were going to get married, and he would take her away from the farm, and they would live happily ever after. Unfortunately for Nannie, that's not exactly how that would play out. After just 4 short months, the couple did get married, but there was a little hiccup that Nannie wasn't privy to before they wed, and that was Charlie's mother, Mrs. Bragg. Nannie didn't know that Charlie and his mother lived together, and Miss Bragg had a very specific idea of how her son should be treated by his wife. She had super high expectations of how her son should be treated, as well as how the house should be kept. And despite her claimed illness, Miss Bragg saw to it every day that Nannie was living up to those standards. Because of his mother, the marriage was rocky from the jump. Like, literally, starting from the morning after the wedding, when Miss Bragg was basically demanded Nannie to make Charlie breakfast before he left for work. Like, when Nannie came downstairs, Mrs. Bragg was sitting at the table, and she was like, "Hey, where's his breakfast? He's fixing to go to work." And Nannie was like, "Huh? What?" Anyways, the couple couldn't make any plans together because as soon as they did, Mrs. Bragg's illness would magically flare up every time in one way or another, so they'd have to cancel. And another thing Miss Bragg did that really sent Nannie over the edge was when she destroyed Nannie's romance magazines, claiming them to be smut or equivalent to cheating. In order to cope with the stress of living with Charlie's mother, Nannie began drinking, which in turn caused her depression to get worse. But despite that, Nannie would push through the moods and do her best to live up to her mother-in-law's impossible standards, at least for a little while, until the couple began having children. Once that happened, the power kind of shifted in Nannie's favor. She now had a foolproof reason that Miss Bragg couldn't ruin her marriage and a tie that even Miss Bragg couldn't break. They would go on to have 4 girls. The first in 1923, her name was Melvina, and the last in 1927, and her name was Florine. And with every pregnancy, she would grow to hate Charlie and his mother more and more. Nannie began doing whatever she could to escape. She started going to bars and sleeping around with any man that made her feel pretty, not bearing in mind that Charlie too was stepping out on the marriage and Nannie knew all about it. When it came to the stress of caring for 4 children a year apart, all under the age of 5, and an essentially absent husband, it became too much for Nannie to handle, and by this point, Charlie's cheating had gotten worse. He would stay gone for days at a time. Sadly, over time, Nannie started to believe that her biggest problem and the reason she could no longer get out of the house to try and find true romance or focus on herself at all was simple. She had too many kids. Life was much simpler when she only had one. Nannie absolutely loved and adored Melvina. But the other 3, in her mind, they were expendable. So, the next time Charlie went on one of his outings. By the time he got home, the couple's two middle children were deceased. The doctors knew it was food poisoning, but they couldn't really explain how or why, other than they were the only two that had eaten porridge that morning for breakfast, so perhaps the grains in it were somehow contaminated, which is kind of what they came to the conclusion of, so they threw out anything that had grains in it in the house, assuming that that's what had caused the problem. Florine was still breastfeeding, so she didn't eat it, and Malvina ended up getting toast. So I think I read. Nannie would end up looking like a strong but grieving mother, and Charlie who showed up back the day the children died, only to find the bulk of the town in his house consoling his wife. He would be shunned by the town for his lack of presence when the children died. For a moment, Charlie fell into this new line of shame that had been bestowed upon him by almost everyone around him. Everyone except Nannie. When he looked in her cold, empty eyes, he knew she had killed the girls. And he feared for himself and his other two girls. So he fled, and he took Malvina with him. And you may be thinking to yourselves, why didn't he take Florine? Florine was actually sleeping in the bed with Nannie, like in her arms, so he wasn't able to get her. But if he could have gotten her, he would have taken her. Malvina was the only one of the kids that Nannie truly cared about, so him taking her absolutely devastated Nannie. Charlie was gone for a year. Now, during that time, his mother would grow sicker and sicker, and Nannie would take up work at a local sawmill to try to make ends meet. His mother would pass away before his return. Again, her death wasn't questioned because everyone knew of her illness and just assumed she died from that. So, Nannie wasn't even given a second glance. Charlie came back in the summer of 1928. He wanted his house back and a divorce. He didn't come back alone, though. Thank God for him. He had his girlfriend, Malvina, and his girlfriend's son with him. Nannie would begrudgingly take the couple's two children and move back in with her parents. This is when Nannie would go back to reading her romance magazines, but she was looking for real romance, not articles. So that's when she found the Lonely Hearts column. Sound familiar? Sound like one of the nicknames I mentioned in the beginning of the episode? And this column is where people, mostly men, would put out ads looking for love. She quickly responded to some of them, and this is where Franklin Harris enters, aka Frank. Things started off exactly how Nannie had always dreamed a relationship would. He showered her with gifts and gave her all the attention she could ask for, and he even wrote her poetry. 2 months later, the couple were engaged. After the wedding, the new family moved to a cabin just outside of Cedartown, Georgia, where Frank had just gotten a job. Nannie would quickly discover that Frank had a bit of a drinking problem. As their marriage moved on, so did Frank's drinking. He began staying gone more and more to drink with his friends. One night, while out drinking, Frank would get into a fight and find himself arrested. When Nannie went to go get him, she discovered that this was not an isolated incident. In fact, she found out that he had been arrested several times in Florida for barroom fights, and that's why he had fled the state to start a new life. Nannie was furious. She then tried to help him stop drinking, but this backfired. Led to him going and drinking a lot more. He started going on binges with his friends for days at a time. Sound familiar? So that's when Nannie decided if you can't beat him, join him. So she started going on benders with him. Malvina, at the time that this started happening, she was a teenager, and usually she was at a friend's house, but Florine was just kind of left to fend for herself. And this caused Florine to be taken from the couple by the police and delivered to Alabama to live with her father, Charlie. Nannie immediately stormed to Charlie's house to get her daughter back. This little episode seemed to end Nannie's drinking, but it certainly didn't stop or slow down Frank's drinking in any way. That's all about the same time frame when Frank became abusive, not only to Nannie, but to the girls as well. And that would go on until Melvina got married and left the house. She would marry a man by the name of Mosey Haynes, and a year later, the couple would have a baby boy that they would name Robert Lee Haynes. He was born in 1943. And this gave Florine a reason to leave Nannie and Frank's house as well. She moved in with Melvina and her husband to help care for little Robert. By 1944, Melvina was pregnant again, and Nannie was enraged. She felt that a second baby would be too much too soon and burden Melvina more than she could handle, the same way having children so close in age had done to her. Nannie despised this baby from the second she knew of it. In July of 1945, Melvina would experience an extremely difficult labor. In doing so, she wanted her mother by her side. After hours of labor, a baby girl was born. She was born healthy. Melvina passed out from exhaustion from the hard labor she had just gone through, leaving Nannie to look after the baby. Within an hour, the baby had died. The doctors concluded that the baby must have gone without oxygen for too long and couldn't make it independently. However, upon arriving home, Melvina would express to Florine and Mosey that she had had an awful dream, and in it she saw Nannie take a pin out of her hat and push it into the soft spot of the baby's head. That's when Florine told Melvina that when she had re-entered the hospital room after the baby had passed, she witnessed Nannie fiddling with a hat pin in her hands. Both girls decided that those thoughts were impossible. There's no way Nannie would ever have harmed the baby, and that was that. And they kind of just tried to suppress that and move on. After this happened, Melvina and Mosey's marriage quickly began to crumble, and Melvina would begin sleeping with the man outside of her marriage, leaving little Robert in Nannie's care more and more. One weekend, Melvina had brought Robert to Nannie's to drop him off for a weekend stay, as she had been doing, so she could go be with her lover. And Nannie and Melvina got into a huge fight. Melvina would eventually get frustrated and bark at Nannie that it was her life and she'd do what she pleased, and Nannie needed to butt out. Then Melvina sped off, leaving little Robert and an extremely angry Nannie. The only target directly in front of her that she could use to get back at Melvina was poor little Robert. Within the weekend, he would be dead, fed rat poison and cookies by his grandmother. When the doctors came to conclude the cause of death, asphyxia is what they came up with, a result of something they called cot death at the time. He was lying in his bed by the time the doctor got there, so 2 and 2 together, that conclusion made sense to them somehow. Nannie was completely cleared of any cause for suspicion, at least by most people. By this point, Frank had shown back up, and after Robert's funeral, Frank, Melvina, and Florine would discuss how they suspected Nannie of causing Robert's death and the baby's death, with Frank even expressing his concerns that she might want to kill him next. It would also be discovered that Nannie had actually taken a life insurance policy out on her grandson that Melvina knew nothing about. After that, Melvina and Mosey would actually reconcile, but the girls would never have anything else to do with their mother again, which was probably the best decision they could have made. Frank had begun getting into more and more bar fights by this point. On August 15th, 1945, the war ended and the soldiers were set to come home, so Frank talked his co-workers into going out for drinks to celebrate, and boy did he celebrate. He would drink into the morning hours, and when everyone else had gone to bed or gone home, he would call Nannie to come and get him. He had had a great day of celebrating and was feeling rather frisky. It led him to pushing himself on her. She told him no, but for Frank, no wasn't an option. He would get what he wanted whether she wanted to give it to him or not. This was the moment that Nannie decided Frank would in fact be her next. She poured rat poison in his moonshine, which he wouldn't suspect because the jug of moonshine was hidden and she had accidentally happened upon it, so she was very careful to hide it back exactly where and how she found it, and it worked. She would find Frank's body the following day. When the police came, they immediately smelled booze, and Frank's reputation as a drunk made it a pretty easy conclusion. His drinking had finally gotten him. Frank's death couldn't have worked out any better for Nannie. Frank had a pretty sizable life insurance policy that Nannie now had her hands on. And with that policy, Nannie would use that money to buy land in Jacksonville, Alabama, 10 acres in fact. She also built herself a cozy little cottage in the corner and began farming the land for supplemental income. Once she was settled in there, she began looking for her next husband, and so back to the Lonely Hearts column she went. She decided this time that the men could flock to her, so she took out her own ad in the column, and that's how she met Arlie Lanning from Lexington, North Carolina. Although I did read that he was actually born in Alabama. So. It was pretty clear to Nannie rather quickly that Arlie was a bit of a womanizer, kind of a ladies' man. But he was able to convince her that he was ready to settle down, and she truly believed that she could change his gallivanting ways. 2 years after Frank's death, she would ride a train to Lexington to meet her new suitor. He was floored by her beauty. Even at 42 years old, she was in his eyes the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. After just 2 days, Arlie proposed, and within a week, they were married. Because of her general mistrust of men, which I find extremely ironic, and knowing he was a womanizer, she had the women of the town watching her new husband for her, and they were letting her know what he was doing and where he was going and who he was with, and it would soon come to light, like within a month, that Arlie too was a drinker and was not able to rein in his womanizing ways, as she thought she could get him to do. So yet again, Nannie found that her dream of true love and romance was shattered. To his credit, Arlie did try to straighten up and do right for a short period of time. But the new him wasn't well received by most of the people who knew him before, especially his coworkers, who started encouraging him to begin drinking again. And that's really all it took for him to start drinking again. But this would be like a back and forth sober, not sober thing, and it would go on for years. The result was that they both were off again and on again, stepping out of the marriage. This little game continued for 5 years until one day Nannie just snapped and decided enough was enough. She would go on to make Arlie his favorite pie, a pie in which she had pulled out her usual tricks and added a little something extra to. Arlie was pronounced dead by a doctor the following morning. Cause of death, heart failure, or flu death, which actually was going around at the time. It's kind of happening all over. And yet again, Nannie played the role of the poor grief-stricken wife, and everyone flocked in to support her, even her mother-in-law, who Nannie would end up moving in with her. One thing she didn't see coming, Arlie never updated his will, which he had written before their marriage. So the house Nannie was banking on getting went to his sister. She also never took out a life insurance policy on him, so she didn't have any money coming her way either. But Nannie was crafty and wasn't going to let these little oversights stop her from getting what she felt she deserved, what she had earned. She figured out that if something were to happen to the house, let's say a fire perhaps, she would get the money. So, shortly after, lo and behold, the house would burn to the ground. Shortly after Arlie's passing, his mother, who Nannie was still living with and caring for, fell ill with, you guessed it, severe stomach aches. Shortly after, she would die from her illness, and again Nannie came out looking like the saint that had somehow managed to care for the elderly woman day and night until her dying day, despite her herself being a grieving widow. This lady is awful. After that, Nannie went back to Alabama and back to the Lonely Hearts column. Among the letters coming in from the column, responses were letters asking Nannie to go visit her sister because she had fallen ill. Her sister's name was Dovey, and when Nannie arrived at her house, Dovey was in an awful state of weakness. So Nannie began taking care of her. A week later, after no signs of Dovey's health improving under Nannie's care, Nannie decided the best thing to do for her sister was to be merciful to her condition, which would no doubt continue to decline, and a week after Nannie's arrival, Dovey would pass, chalked up simply to her succumbing to her illness. Dovey's funeral is when Nannie would learn of her father James's death. Nannie was devastated at this news. Not because she gave a damn about James, but because her plans for vengeance on him were now ruined. Where was she now to place her anger? Then it hit her. Her mother was still alive. Once they were together, Nannie just became angrier and angrier of all the things her mother had allowed to happen to her over the years. In the midst of her anger, it also began to register that people were going to expect her to care for her widowed elderly mother now. No way. She wasn't doing it. That's when Nannie made her mother the same sweet with a bitter aftertaste prune pie she had made so many others before her, and her mother would pass away the same way the others who had eaten this particular concoction had done before her. Now Nannie was completely free, and also completely alone. That's when she joined the Diamond Circle Club. And it was 1953 by this point, and this club was another way for people to mingle. That would be how she met Richard Morton from Kansas. Richard was retired and in his 60s at the time that they met. Richard and Nannie would become married within a month of meeting. Richard was not abusive nor drunk and was home with Nannie most of the time. At first, he seemed picture perfect. But like always, over time, his flaws would surface. See, he would buy Nannie these really lavish gifts constantly. And she loved the gifts. But when he'd do that, it was usually after he had gone to run errands and stayed gone for like a really long time, which seemed strange to her. And then there was the fact that he could go wherever he wanted alone, but she couldn't. And he literally escorted her everywhere she went, except for one place, which was the hair salon. That's where Nannie would learn that she wasn't the only person he was giving gifts to. Not only that, but she would also learn that he was in major debt, like a lot of it, and his gift buying was just making it worse. Nannie was furious about this betrayal. She took out 2 life insurance policies on her husband. She also found out that the life insurance policies that he had had on himself weren't even enough to cover part of the debt he had already accrued, let alone what he was still tacking on by spending how he was, so she decided she needed to expedite the timeline of cashing out those policies before Richard could take any more money out of her pockets. 3 months after saying "I do," Richard was served one of Nannie's homemade pies. His wasn't prune, though, like the others had been. His was apple, and he was dead by morning. The doctors found nothing suspicious at all about his death, and Nannie walked away with $2,000 in her pocket, which today would be around $23,640. Nannie was again on the prowl and had more money than she knew what to do with. She decided to do some traveling. While traveling, she was still writing letters to men all over the country, and 2 years after Richard's death, she would meet Samuel Doss from Oklahoma. He was 59 at the time that they met, and he worked as a highway inspector, and he was also a preacher. He wasn't like any of her other husbands. He wasn't a drunk, he wasn't abusive, he wasn't a womanizer, but he was very, very strict on his daily routines. He did everything from the time he woke up until the time he went to bed, which both of those times were also scheduled. He did all of that on a very set schedule and routine. And he definitely expected Nannie to comply and follow this set routine. And he also had extremely high expectations when it came to keeping the house clean. He also kept an eye on every single penny that came in and out of the house. He told her when she could or could not do anything at all. He also was against watching TV, and he was against Nannie's romance stories. Nannie began to feel like she was back on her father's farm. She began to feel like she was trapped. This was not a happy home. This was not the happy home that she had dreamed of, so she fled back to her home in Alabama. But instead of leaving well enough alone, like he probably should have, Samuel had written his wife a letter that was waiting for her in Alabama by the time she got there. She opened it, thinking it would be an apology for all of what she had just endured under his control, but instead it was a letter telling her why it was in her best interest to go back to him. She was enraged by this letter. All she could see was her father, a bully, a man who felt he had the right to tell her what she could and could not do. Unbeknownst to Samuel, in her eyes, here was a man giving her an opportunity to exact the revenge on her father she hadn't been able to get before. So, Nannie would return to Samuel, but not under the pretenses he thought she did. Nannie had plans, and all she had to do was wait until the perfect time to execute them. That perfect time would find itself in the moment that Samuel had thrown out all of her romance magazines. His death was a little different than the rest. Instead of giving him one fatal dose, she started slowly poisoning his coffee. And he started slowly going downhill until he ended up bedridden for a week. The doctors thought he had some kind of an intestinal infection, so they were giving him penicillin, and he was getting 24-hour around-the-clock care until he was better at home, but he wasn't getting better at home, so he was taken to the hospital. After 23 days, he would survive and be released to go home from the hospital. The night he was released, Nannie had prepared a beautiful meal for him to indulge on as a welcome home gift. Samuel was grateful and impressed. He sat down and ate the food and drank the coffee and was overjoyed. After Samuel moved to his chair in the living room, he began wailing in pain, while Nannie just told him he must have overeaten, and she began reading a magazine, just waiting for the food and the coffee to take hold. By morning, Samuel was dead. Nannie would call the doctor, and he would conclude that he died from his infection that he had been suffering from for the days before his death. His body was sent to the morgue, but once the doctor who had been caring for Samuel in the hospital, Dr. Schwelben, found out that his patient had died less than 24 hours after being released, something didn't sit quite right with him. So, he would kind of take matters into his own hands, and he would approach Nannie in front of a bunch of guests that were at her house consoling her, and he would begin to tell her how suspicious Samuel's death was, and asked her permission to perform an autopsy on her husband. She was kind of in a corner, and And by this point, he was saying it so loudly that all the guests' interest had been piqued. And so she kind of couldn't say no without looking suspicious herself, so she gave him permission to perform the autopsy. Once an autopsy was done, the doctor would go on to say he found enough cyanide in Samuel's stomach to kill a horse. Obviously, Nannie was the number one suspect, and she was immediately arrested. This is where the nickname the Giggling Grannie came from. When the police arrested her, she wasn't devastated or shocked or even playing the role of the innocent, grieving wife she had done so many times before. Oh no. Instead, she was giggling and continued to giggle throughout the whole process. It would take hours of interrogation to get her to crack, but she would eventually crack and confess to killing all of her husbands except Charlie, who was still alive. The agent who was able to finally get her to confess hours into the interrogation, his name was Ray Page. Page took the confessions he could get and arrested Nannie, and then ordered the rest of the people on the list of people who had died around Nannie or under her care to be exhumed. They exhumed everyone other than her 2 children, and every single person had arsenic in their system. They chose not to exhume the children just because it wasn't necessary by that point. They had plenty of proof. Before the trial began for the murder of Samuel Doss, they gave her a psych evaluation, and it was determined that she was rendered sane and fit to stand trial. She would plead guilty, and on June 2nd, 1955, she was sentenced to life in prison. And if you're wondering why they only charged her with Samuel's death despite her confessing to the other crimes, he was the only one that actually happened in Oklahoma, and the trial was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So it's the only one they really could try her for. Once the media got a hold of this story, Nannie would soak up the spotlight as quickly as she could. She did every interview she could do and would always giggle all the way through each one. Nannie would go on to do these interviews until she got sick, and she would pass away on June 2nd, 1965 from leukemia in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. And although she did die alone, my personal opinion, she still died a far better death than she deserved. But that's just me. But yeah, that is the story of Nannie Doss, aka the Giggling Grannie, who got away with way more crimes than she ever should have been able to get away with. So if you liked that story, subscribe, give us a like, let us know. Feel free to reach out. Again, sorry if it was weird that you were just hanging out with me and my dog in my bedroom and not my office with my sister. But hopefully you enjoyed the case just the same. And our next case will continue to be in Alabama. We still got one more true crime and one more ghost story coming to you from Alabama. And you've still got time to throw in a request for that state if you have one, or any other state in the country. United States, if you have one that you want to hear, ghost or true crime. But yeah, you know how to reach us. YouTube, TikTok till Sunday, but anyway, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Music, iHeartRadio, any of those. We have our own email, renderthedarknesspod@gmail.com. We have a website. You can reach us on the website. So any of those avenues, if you want to contact us and reach out, please feel free to do that. Facebook, if I didn't say Facebook. And we thank you for spending your time with us today. I thank you for spending your time with me today, I should say. And yeah. This was Render the Darkness.